All right. So we are recording, just so you're aware. If, like I said, if you'd prefer not to be on camera, you can turn your video off. But first, I want to welcome everyone to the CEDIK Downtown webinar series. Today, we have the Kentucky Brownfields program with us. And we're going to talk about redeveloping and financing and identifying and working with the program to really focus on some of those downtown projects that we all have in our communities. So during this webinar, staff from the Kentucky Brownfields that I'm going to introduce you to in just a few moments, we'll be sharing an overview of the program, how to work with the program, sort of the benefits of redeveloping sites, sort of walking you all through the process of working with them and accessing the benefits of the program. And then, you know, there's going to be some resources and ideas and hopefully some inspiration that we can take beyond this webinar and really develop a new relationship with all of the new staff members and new faces with the Kentucky Brownfields program. So that was also one of the reasons that I wanted to have this webinar, is that as you may know, there's been a number of staff changes there and new faces perhaps that you haven't worked with in the past. And I wanted to make sure that you all knew who those folks were and who you can reach out to. So without further ado, I'm going to make a couple introductions, and then I'm going to turn it over to our guests and let them run through their presentation. So today we have two folks that I really want you all to get to know. The first is Miss Lynn True, and she's been a state employee for 25 years, working both in resource and environmental agencies. She's currently serving as the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Kentucky Brownfields Redevelopment Program, and that falls under the Department of Environmental Protection. Her educational background in environmental science and work experience with environmental regulations, local planning and assistance, outreach and education allows her to assist local governments with some pretty complex issues, including the redevelopment programs that the Brownfields program oversees, policies, public participation, and all sorts of other stuff related to solid waste and brownfields redevelopment. So her primary goals with the Brownfields program are to assist local governments with planning, redevelopment, and involving the public in those processes. So I want to welcome Lynn True with us today, but I also want to introduce Eric. Now I was saying it perfectly earlier, Eisenminger. Awesome. Okay. And he's worked for the Department for Environmental Protection for 23 years. He replaced Herb Pettigene. If you had happened to work with Herb in the past, this is sort of our new Herb to reach out to, the new face of the program, if you will. And his education and science background range from biology to environmental contaminants. He also has experience in construction and renovation and utility work, which we all know is critical to these redevelopment projects. And his background allows him to bring all of those skill sets to this program. As you can imagine, it's tied to all of the facets of brownfield redevelopment. And his role as Brownfield Coordinator is to assist communities and nonprofits to get old, abandoned, and blighted buildings or property tracts back into productive reuse. So I welcome both of you. Thank you both for joining us. And Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you to share your screen, and we'll go ahead and jump right into the presentation. I will ask everyone, if you haven't muted, to go ahead and mute yourself. And as Lynn's getting that pulled up, I will remind you, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and add those into the chat box, and we will circle back to them at the end of the presentation.
Great, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, Shane, and thank you all for joining us today. This webinar again is being provided by the Kentucky Brownfield program, Eric and myself, and there are other staff in a different division. However, they do more of the Superfund sites that we will get into during this presentation. But we are a state-run program. We fall under the Kentucky Department for Environmental Protection, and we are in the Division of Compliance Assistance. So that is primarily our job. It's to assist and provide guidance and to help out stakeholders, the communities, pretty much everyone in this webinar with your efforts. So we do partner with a lot of different agencies, both federal and state and local. and for the common goal of trying to redevelop brownfield sites. So with that said, today we're going to mostly focus on kind of giving you the basics of what brownfields are and what the available resources are that you can all kind of utilize or at least explore in trying to pursue some of these projects. Eric will provide you a little bit more of a technical angle and actually go into the steps that are involved with the redevelopment process, just so that you kind of have an overview of what the process looks like from a developer's point of view. So I'll cover part one. Again, Eric will cover part two. I'll cover the overview and the history, talk about funding and incentives, and then how you can go about implementing your projects and meeting goals. So to start with, the very basics, of course, is to define what a brownfield is. Brownfields are properties that are contaminated or thought to be contaminated and are underutilized because of concerns with cleanup costs and liability. Now, these sites go by a lot of different names. You've probably heard them considered contaminated sites, but again, they're potentially contaminated, perceived as contaminated, abandoned properties, dilapidated buildings, blighted areas, vacated lots, wasted or fallow lands, distressed zones, and of course, they're all barriers to development. So that's just the broad overview of what a brownfield is. That's kind of the easy definition for it. Now, if you were to actually pursue a brownfield project and attempt to redevelop one of these sites, then it would be in your best interest to understand what the legal definition is. And that's because a lot of the policies and incentives that are provided to you are based on what this legal definition is provided by the federal government as well as by state government. So this slide is primarily just to provide you with a reference point for if you need to look into the legal aspects of what a brownfield is. Now, it is important too to understand, like I said a little bit earlier, that some folks tend to confuse brownfields with a Superfund site. And the difference is that in the degree of the hazards, the difference is that Superfund sites are our nation's worst environmental hazards, whereas brownfields aren't quite as much of a threat to the environment or to the public. So brownfields are not usually dangerous to humans. They're usually cleaned up by owners, the previous owner, or state governments or local governments. And it's really much more about, as much as it is about cleaning up the environment, it's also about real estate and making your community stronger. So brownfield sites, again, differ from Superfund sites in that the degree of how bad they are. So to give you a little view of some examples of buildings with asbestos, lead, and other hazardous materials, to give you some examples of what a brownfield site actually is, we'll take a look at some of these photos. Pictures worth 1,000 words, so it's easier to kind of visualize what it is using these. Former gas stations, auto repair shops, former dry cleaning establishments, former factories, old schools, old hospitals, abandoned landfills, old mining sites, old rail yards and shipyards. These are all brownfield sites. They're either known to have contamination at the site, or they are perceived to have contamination, which equally affects its ability to be redeveloped or to have investors interested in redeveloping it. So again, it's that key word, perception. It may or may not be contaminated, but it's a brownfield because of perception, and it's difficult to redevelop because of that. So what are some examples of redevelopment? A remodeled building with energy efficient features. All of these are sites in Kentucky, all of these photos. You can see a riverfront of Owensboro. This is full of entertainment and restaurants now. It had been an area that it was kind of a distressed area and needed some attention. Brownfields can be easily turned into parks and recreation areas, new or retail or new commercial property, upgraded residential housing, community centers, gardens, all sorts of ways you can redevelop a brownfield site. So how did we get all of these sites? How did we end up in a position to have brownfields in our state? And there's about an estimated 8,000 brownfields in Kentucky. I think through the nation, there's about an estimated of 450,000. So these sites are everywhere. They're found in all of our communities. And the reason being is because really of what went on in our history. So we kind of have to go back to the 1800s, 1900s, and take into consideration what our socioeconomics have been and how they've evolved over the years. So obviously we went through an industrial revolution. During this time, there weren't environmental regulations around. So there were quite a bit of contaminations through spills and leaks, and those things just weren't taken care of. And in fact, oftentimes they were just buried or discarded or pushed on down the river. That's actually a photo of Maysville, Kentucky back in its heyday. 1960s and 1990s, this was a very important time in environmental history anyway, because that's when a lot of federal laws were established that created the framework for the Environmental Protection Agency, state environmental protection agencies, as well as federal. And during this time, there was just a whole lot of changes made to how it is we go about conserving our resources, protecting our resources, and protecting our environment as a whole. Just to give you a little rundown of some things that went on through that time period. 1965, we saw the Solid Waste Disposal Act. So we started cleaning up our act, literally, in waste management, began to offer collection services and actual landfills, not just town dumps. But the Solid Waste Act was one of the very first pieces of legislation towards protecting the environment. In 1970, that's when EPA started. Clean Air Act was also established in 1970, and that regulated air emissions. 1972, the Clean Water Act set guidelines for the discharge of contaminants into our waters. And then other key legislations were the Endangered Species Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, that was 76. And in 1980, now we're kind of getting into some legislation and some acts that directly relate to brownfield sites. So 1980, the Comprehensive Environmental Response and Compensation Liability Act, commonly called CERCLA, was established. And this site, or this particular act, established site liability and responsibilities. Very important things going on here. At this point in time, legislation was passed so that owners, historically, these owners would be responsible or liable for the contamination on their properties. So this is also goes by the Superfund program. Now we'll see how that's evolved over the years, but that's what was going on in 1980. And in 1990, that's when we actually began to see legislation to address brownfields. So during this time, laws relating to contaminated property basically discouraged development. In addition, our country began to see an economic shift and an increase in urbanization. So as a result, many of these early industries and factories, they moved or they became obsolete. And they also kind of opened the way to have more businesses come in, like gas stations, dry cleaning establishments, hospitals, schools, and so forth. And then these sites brought the potential for additional contamination and pollution. So in the early 1990s, we saw a lot of these issues, and these properties that had been abandoned, people didn't want to invest in or redevelop because they were basically scared of the liabilities and the costs that might be associated with trying to redevelop such a site. So it was really very much a turnoff, and these sites just became, basically even worse. So 1995, EPA initiated the very first brownfields projects. This was through the Brownfields and Land Revitalization. program, and it focused on helping local governments. So this was especially for local communities, local governments, stakeholders with cleanup and redevelopment. So the government was hearing the concerns of local officials, local leaders, and responding to it. So they were trying to figure out a way to basically help with changing these properties and turning them around. So they started with providing some seed money and a few pilot projects and seeing how this would go forward. In '97, they appropriated $10 million, and this went to state voluntary cleanup programs. And that enables, programs like our own, Eric will talk a little bit more about here in a minute, but that enables the Kentucky Brownfield program to conduct site assessments or environmental site assessments, which is a critical and an initial part of beginning a redevelopment process. So in 2002, the Brownfield Law, as it's called or known as, basically this was the Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act. This authorized funding for assessment, cleanup, and revolving loans. Supplemental funds were also authorized for targeted brownfield assessments, state response programs, research, training, and technical assistance. Very important piece of legislation that was in '02 that really got the ball rolling with brownfield projects. Also in this legislation, it clarified, this is very important, it clarified the liability requirements that had historically been followed under surplus. So this '02 legislation basically provided liability protections for innocent landowners, contiguous property owners, and bona fide prospective purchasers. So finally, there was something in place that would basically appeal to investors and resolve some of the concerns that even local governments or state governments had when trying to redevelop these types of sites. So with all this legislation at the federal level, Kentucky lawmakers also kind of responded to the concerns of that time. They too became interested in economic development and how to improve these sites for that purpose. Kentucky passed a law to further support and encourage economic redevelopment with liability protections on the state level. And so this is the Kentucky Brownfield Law. And you can find it in KRS 224-1-415. Again, the only reason I put in these regulatory statutes and regulations is for your reference if you were to pursue a project and needed the specific information on those things. Of course, our program can also provide guidance because it's legalese and sometimes difficult to interpret. So why is it important to clean up brownfields? Why would this be important to a county judge, mayor, magistrate, city planner, a developer, a nonprofit group, or really anyone involved in managing and serving the community? Why would this be of importance to know about brownfield laws? And of course, the answer is that these laws provide incentives and resources that ultimately lead to economic and community development. So it's just to better serve your community. Communities benefit by returning properties to tax rolls, increasing the tax base, by creating spaces for community uses, by adding jobs to both during the cleanup process and the construction phase and even after the redevelopment process, and reducing maintenance costs by utilizing existing infrastructure that's already there because these sites are typically located in prime locations. Communities also benefit socially because reusing brownfield sites reduces the residents' exposure to environmental hazards. So this is of utmost importance, especially when it comes to ensuring environmental justice. So for developers, brownfield properties are often located in key locations and may be eligible for tax credits and other financial incentives, which we'll go in a little more detail here in a minute. This photo is of the Kentucky Young Center. It's in downtown Louisville, and it's a very good example of how a community as well as investors benefited from redeveloping such a site. This center at one time was a brownfield along the Ohio River, and there wasn't, it was underutilized. It was in a prime location and was not used for the purpose. So it's now an outstanding arena. Of course, it provides an arena for basketball programs, but also a range of venues. They have all kinds of events there. And it was also key for the Louisville community in terms of equal opportunity and local employment. I think there were over 3,500 workers that helped build this arena, and they were selected specifically from that area. Beyond workforce growth, this center also sparked economic growth in downtown Louisville. You can imagine there was more tourism, entertainment, and shopping. So a great success story. That's a big city success story, but it's not just big cities. Brownfield redevelopment can be beneficial to all size communities. So kind of a quick rundown. We've already kind of discussed the benefits to the community, but to put it in a list form here, of course, it improves environmental quality. What are the benefits of cleaning up a brownfield? It improves environmental quality. It supports environmental justice. Environmental justice being referenced or referred to as EJ, which we're hearing a lot about EJ here lately, and that might be something to kind of key into for funding, maybe in the future for various projects, just for that purpose. Environmental justice essentially involves distressed communities or marginalized communities that may or may not have historically had the best protections against environmental hazards, and perhaps these were areas that more facilities located in because of that. So environmental justice is really about making sure that all communities have equal rights to environmental protection and also a voice in making decisions about what locates there. So that's a very important benefit to the community. And again, that's the whole spectrum. That's everything from a inner city to a rural Appalachian community. If it's a community that has historically been kind of targeted for unwanted land type uses, then it's an EJ community. And Brownfield program is a very big part of helping those types of communities. Obviously, again, we talked about it creates local jobs, helps the tax revenue. It attracts investors, so it's just going to kind of build on itself. It reduces sprawl, promotes smart growth, because again, it's using infrastructure. It's using areas that are already or at one time had been developed. So it's going to prevent having to develop a whole nother piece of land. It also complements other revitalization efforts. It incorporates community-wide planning, upgrades residential housing by removing asbestos, lead, and other hazardous substances. So an old housing development, for example, can be completely redeveloped, remodeled, or torn to the ground and rebuilt. If it's completely rebuilt, then you can incorporate a lot of energy efficient features. It develops green space by removing underutilized structures and developing, again, areas like parks and gardens and recreation sites. And it expands opportunities overall for live, work, play by improving amenities, transportation, and opportunities for recreation. Benefits to the developer, again, this is why a developer would take interest in such a site. Reduced price. Typically, these sites can be acquired at a greatly reduced price. Prime location. Brownfields are often located in a highly desirable area. We've talked about that. Existing infrastructure. Usually there's already access to electric, water, sewer, transportation, so there's no need to make for those provisions. That's always an added cost, but a developer wouldn't have to worry about that if they're building on something that's already there. Tax and economic incentives, favorable zoning and land use provisions, and of course, public support and partnerships. Communities are nearly always very supportive of having these areas developed and improved. Given the nature of the property, obviously there have to be incentives for these developers because essentially they're going to have to use some of their own resources to evaluate the opportunity. So they at times have to put up the upfront money just to do the background work to determine if it's worthwhile to even invest in. So there have to be incentives to along the way to encourage them to pursue them. So on that note, who are the different people that are involved in a redevelopment process? Brownfields can be redeveloped by private or public, local governments, or private-public partnerships. Most projects require a great deal of coordination and collaboration among a lot of different stakeholders. So the critical players include, of course, the property owners, which can be public or private. The role of the property owner is basically to sell or to attract a developer to invest in that property. The buyers, again, can be public or private. Their role as real estate purchasers is to seek to maximize profits through reselling the property, or they'll invest in it as a long-term ownership and management. The public sector obviously is involved in it. You have local, state, federal governments, nonprofit organizations. You may have neighborhood and community groups to take an interest in redeveloping an area, quasi-governmental groups. And of course, the whole role of these types of stakeholders is to revitalize the economy and enhance the community and ensure public safety. Private sectors, your developers, investors, lenders, insurers, these folks, of course, they tie the project into a larger redevelopment plan for the community. And other periphery folks who are involved are environmental consultants, engineers, contractors, builders, attorneys, realtors, environmental inspectors and regulators who basically monitor the progress of site development. So what about all of these resources that are available to you? There's financing, assistance, and incentives. So we've established that obviously contamination or the perception of contamination complicates the future use of the property. So because of that, typical financing is usually not available. Lenders may not be comfortable with the unknowns associated with the property. So a quick rundown of the financing includes you have federal grants, you have state grants, state loans, you have private equity, obviously, cash, public funding, and public-private partnerships. In terms of assistance, and this is mostly through our program, but also at the federal level, you have grant writing assistance. We can assist with that, with helping you apply for funding of various brownfield grants. Again, we do the site assessments, and that will be explained further by Eric because he's actually our staff member that does the phase 1 environmental site assessments. So he can tell you a lot more about that. And of course, regulatory guidance along the way that can be confusing to folks. So we can provide some direction on that. The incentives include tax incentives, economic incentives, zoning flexibility, liability protections. At the federal level, some of these grant fundings are specifically for assessments, cleanup, multi-purpose, job training, state response. Assessment includes activities such as developing an inventory, prioritizing and planning for a redevelopment, and doing community outreach. So that type of funding that goes for assessment activities are kind of the initial activities involved in pursuing a brownfield redevelopment. Cleanup obviously is for activities that are specifically intended to remediate the site and to rid of any contamination, at least minimize the contamination and contain anything that might be a hazard. Multi-purpose activities are assessment and cleanup activities at one or more brownfield sites in a target area. So this might involve a little bit larger area. There are job training grants through the federal level. Great program. This actually trains residents who are impacted by brownfield sites in their communities and train them on environmental jobs, in fact. And in order to get these or be eligible for federal grants, obviously it has to be a brownfield site with hazardous waste, petroleum contaminants. Public entities and nonprofits, quasi-government, these are the eligible applicants. The cycle is usually in the fall. It's awarded in the spring. Some of these grants, however, are through open solicitation, so it may be any time of year. There may be supplemental funding available. So through the state level, now keep in mind too, at the federal level, that we can help you write grants and assist you with all of the complexities involved in trying to obtain this funding. Now, it's a substantial amount of money, so it's very competitive. Again, we can help you, but the federal level is competitive. That's why you want to get an early start on trying to obtain this type of funding. Now, at the state level, we also have funding available, and this is it's actually through EPA. The funding comes from EPA, but it's funneled through us, and it's as a sub grant to local entities. Grant funding and low interest loans, or even perhaps no interest loans. These are available through what we call our Cleaner Commonwealth Fund, or CCF. So we have a CCF grant funding program. We also have a CCF interest loan, a fund that offers interest loans. And we in fact have one that's open right now. So if you're interested in pursuing a low interest loans, we have some funding for that available right now. And it'll remain available until the funds are exhausted. So it's worth a shot. Site eligibility, again, has to be brownfield. Applicant eligibility, again, public entities, nonprofits, and quasi-governmental entities that include public-private partnerships. Grant cycles vary, and again, like I said, until funds are exhausted, these grants and loans are available to those eligible applicants. In terms of guidance and technical assistance, at the federal level, there are targeted brownfield assessments. This is a program that basically identifies and characterizes brownfield sites. And again, the assistance for TBAs is what we call these targeted brownfield assessments. You can get it directly through the EPA, or and that's through their regional office, which we fall into Region 4, and that's how you would acquire TBA assistance at the federal level. Or it can come from state brownfield programs, which again, we do offer. TBA programs help remove some of the uncertainties involved in redeveloping brownfields. So it's a very important step in the whole process. Basically, it can answer questions like whether or not a property is contaminated, how extensive or perhaps how long remediation might take, whether or not it's even financially feasible, if redevelopment is even feasible for that particular site in your community, and potentially what options are available for after it's redeveloped. How can it be reused? And other questions it can answer are even if the community supports such a project or an effort. So to find out if your community is even interested in pursuing a redevelopment of that area. So those are all initial questions that can be answered through a TBA assessment. More importantly, if you have the TBA already done, then properties become more interesting to investors, more attractive to other investors. It tends to show any potential risks that are associated for it. So that's why it's an important step in the process. So at the federal level, TBAs are conducted by an EPA contractor on behalf of the eligible entity. Services are for an average of $100,000, and the sites for this program are selected locally on a rolling basis. Now, at the state level, we also offer TBAs. Again, this is a free service. These assessments are offered to local governments, nonprofit organizations. They're performed on a first-come, first-served basis. And once they're complete, brownfield staff can provide further assistance for how to move forward with that site and redevelop it, or what some potential reuses are for it. Again, we help with grant writing assistance. We hold workshops. We have grant review events. We have individual services we can provide. We can do individual assistance with your grants, and just basically help make your applications as strong as possible, because again, these federal grants especially are very competitive. And of course, we offer regulatory guidance, being a regulatory agency. So we can help you through the requirements for cleanups and so forth. So some incentives, of course, the main incentive being liability protections. We talked about this a little bit earlier. There's CERCLA, the federal brownfields law, liability protections really opened up an opportunity for these sites to be moved on and improved. But the liability protections were for certain types of owners or purchasers. They were for bona fide prospective purchasers, contiguous property owners, innocent landowners. So that's what these protections were set up specifically for. When approaching a brownfields redevelopment project, there's certain types of protections that you want to be able to, at the state as well as federal level, that you want to be able to defend. State liability protections basically mirror the federal law. And this was the particular law that I talked about earlier that was passed in 2012. This law allows prospective property redevelopers to work with the state to attain a certain level of liability assurance. The property owners must basically, for the particular site to be eligible for this, the contamination of it has to predate the acquisition of it. And all appropriate inquiry has to be performed. And that's essentially an assessment that we'll further explain here in a minute. Certain public notices must be provided. The site has to be in compliance with land use restrictions for that area. Again, the particular owner or purchaser cannot be the responsible party for the contamination, and they cannot be affiliated with anyone responsible for the contamination. And we do have program staff that can specifically assist with this liability protection services. So other tax incentives, other advantages that basically come through the economic development at the state level. Not so much our program, although there are some tax credits that you can contact us for that we can assist in helping you get. State and local property tax credits, income tax credits. To get those, you can submit an application to our Superfund branch and they can assist you with that. Tax increment financing is another option through economic development. You'd have to go directly through the Department for Economic Development. And again, keep in mind that there are incentives with zoning and land use, oftentimes a little more flexible. Electrical utility tariffs, breaks on all sorts of help to get a developer to encourage a developer to pursue the site. So how do brownfield projects support larger revitalization efforts? Here's a good definition that I found of revitalization. It's a cycle of equitable prosperity, improved quality of life, and better environmental health. And it's usually triggered by renewing, reconnecting, or repurposing distressed natural, socio-economic, and human assets. Revitalization efforts basically encompass the environment, the economy, and equity. So at the core of environmental improvements is basically the environment, and it's a fundamental responsibility of all levels of government. So local, state, federal, we are all responsible to some degree to provide for public safety and to prevent pollution. So that's a core reason for redeveloping a brownfield. And of course, it plays into larger revitalization efforts for a particular downtown area. With respect to boosting the economy, the community obviously must offer affordable housing. It must offer job opportunities with living wages, functional infrastructure, convenient amenities to attract private investigators, and all of that will raise the tax base. So one brownfield project can spur a whole revitalization effort. We talked a bit about environmental justice and equity as well. So the concept of social equity ties into EJ, which ensures that the community has equal protection. So now that we've talked a little bit about what a brownfield is, that it's either a contaminated site or a perceived contaminated site, where they're found, both urban and rural areas, usually underserved communities, why it is important to redevelop these sites, for both economic and environmental benefits, obviously. And who is involved in redeveloping brownfields? There's a whole spectrum of different stakeholders involved: government, private, public, and how to go about actually redeveloping such a site. Requires a lot of resources, but there are available resources through federal and state programs. We offer technical assistance and financial resources. So that's kind of an overview and a basics, and give you an idea of what brownfields are all about. And of course, you all are quite familiar with them probably already, and knowing that they do contribute as a problem to your communities that you want to resolve. So I'm going to hand it over to Eric, and he's going to discuss what the stages are that are involved in actually initiating a project and seeing it through, carrying out the activities of cleanup and remediation. And then also, after the cleanup is finished, there's ongoing maintenance that is required for the site. So he'll discuss a little bit about that. And also talk about, he's a little more familiar with my history with brownfields is about 6 months now. So he's a lot more familiar with some of the success stories in Kentucky, and he can elaborate on those, just to give you a reference point for different parts of the state that have really benefited from having pursued one of these sites. So Eric, I will turn it over to you, and I'll continue to advance the slides as you need.
Thank you, Lynn. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you all. I just want to make sure my microphone levels were fine. First of all, I would like to say, I appreciate Shane in that introduction. I do have a background in construction, also environmental science and contamination. And also, I am that guy that drives down the road and sees an old car, a tractor, a barn, a house, and go, man, what if you fix that up? What could you do with that? How beautiful that would be. So the Brownfield program, pretty much ties in every part of my personal and professional life. So I really like what this is. Lynn and I both have a background in enforcing regulations as well. I'll speak on my behalf only. She can, decide for herself, but I'm fascinated with this last few years of my state career as it's winding down to be out of regulatory enforcement. People like to work with us now because our goal is to help them achieve their goals of getting some of these old blighted buildings back into productive reuse. As Lynn said, it takes them out of a problem for the community where you might have kids that hang out and things, maybe there's potential with drugs going on and different things. Or even on a lighter note, let's just take an old theater, get it back into use, because that's a blast from our past that we can get back into and use today. So it's a fabulous program, and I'm honored to be here, and I do my best to fill Herb's shoes, because he was sort of a brownfield star in Kentucky for a long, long time. So let's get into kind of the fun stuff of, we've identified a property, what are we going to do with it? And Lynn's hit on a few of these. I'm going to touch on some of them. Now, keep in mind that this presentation was put together to encompass everyone, including developers. So if a developer is going to look at a property, they're going to have more intricate steps than maybe a community. So I'll kind of try to touch on both of those, the more in-depth and also the less in-depth versions. So here on this slide, we basically show the 3 different phases of pre-development, where you're getting ready and working on determining if this site will meet your needs, then the development of that site, and then followed up by management. The management of that site will be determined based on what you have found in your phase 1, but mostly the phase 2 determinations. And a phase 2 is where there's actually sampling. It's intrusive. Either a consultant or maybe our agency, depending on the situation, will come in and do soil borings or take groundwater samples to actually make a determination as to whether or not contamination does exist. And then if it's there, what do we do with it? So that's kind of the management. Okay, Lynn, next slide. We'll start talking about the pre-development. And Lynn touched on this. EPA is the highest environmental enforcement agency in the United States. EPA has come out and said, if you want any kind of liability protection from some past use of this property, you have to do an all appropriate inquiry. That is the environmental liability, or the start of the environmental liability relief. Now, EPA came out and said, look, if you want to do the phase 1 environmental site assessment, that will meet the requirements of our AAI. So if you've been in and around this community, everyone talks about phase 1s, get your phase 1. Okay, so that the phase 1 was set up by ASTM, and EPA has just allowed the phase 1 to meet the criteria of the all appropriate inquiry. So as we go through this presentation, if I say phase 1, just understand that is meeting EPA's requirement for your AAI. And what is it? We're going to research the property, the owners, and the past uses. The past uses are the key because you're going to look at what has been done on this property that is likely to lead to environmental contamination. What's the likelihood? So in other words, a gas station. Just a gas station with underground storage tanks in and of itself presents a likelihood that there is petroleum contamination at that site. So that's what we're looking for, is the past. And why is that important? Because if you, in Kentucky, if you do, and in many other states, if you don't get a phase 1 prior to acquisition of a property, once you buy it, you own it, and you own the contamination that is there if it's present. The phase 1 actually comes in and says, now wait just a minute, prior to Mr. or Miss so-and-so buying this property, here's what's happened in the past. And these are the potential contamination events that could have happened with those past uses. So when Mr. or Mrs. Community came in and bought this property, they aren't responsible because they don't do those things. And those things happen prior to their acquisition. So that's kind of what the phase 1 or AAI is doing. It's a book report of the property. So at that point, you also need to analyze your costs and potential reuse to determine feasibility. If you've got a really contaminated site, probably not a place to put an orphanage or an elementary school. But if you have a pretty contaminated site, it may not be a bad place to put a parking lot where you are simply storing vehicles that you are working on. There is a factory in Louisville. They don't build trucks, but they modify those trucks for like utility usage. They actually took over a brownfield. They're purchasing it. They're going to pave the whole thing. They're going to store trucks that are going through their process. Great reuse for them. And the site wasn't poorly or really badly contaminated, but it's a great place, even if it was. No one lives there. No one's staying there for 8 hours a day. You're just driving the truck, parking it, and leaving. So what's the reuse? You need to work on your planning documents. We mentioned here that develop the pro forma and sale agreement. So those are basically documents where you're going to look at what's the cost to develop and remediate the property versus what are our returns. Now, if you're a community group or an organization, business people might shudder to hear this, but a lot of our community groups aren't necessarily concerned with the return financially. If you're going to put a green space or a park in for an EJ community, you won't have a financial return, so to speak. It's basically financial liability because you're going to maintain that park forever. But the returns come in the hearts and minds of the people that get to use that green space and enjoy it. So, business people are looking for what's the financial return. A lot of times government and communities are looking for what's the return for our local residents, or even visiting guests to the community. What can they do with this? So there's not always the financial return. And then pursue and funding and insurance. Now, Lynn talked a little about the funding, and I'll quickly answer Paul's question. you can couple our grants or EPA's loans with AML funding. Being awarded one grant or one fund does not preclude you from also applying and being awarded funding from others. And sometimes it's actually a benefit, because one of the things that EPA is concerned with if you were to request a brownfield grant is, if we've never worked with this group or these people, how comfortable are we that they are going to be able to manage this fund in the manner they've projected in their application? If you have had other funding, then they have a report card, so to speak, that they can kind of go, you know what, they did really good with this AML funding. So they still need money. It's a good project, and we're confident that they can handle this funding well too. Yes, you can couple funding, and sometimes it works well. And real quickly, Lynn also mentioned our Cleaner Commonwealth Fund. If you are a community group or a nonprofit, there is no interest, okay? If you are a private developer, you can qualify for CCF funding, but there will be a low interest charged to for-profit organizations. But communities and nonprofits, currently, we are not even requesting any interest. It's just basically pay the loan back in a 15-year time period is usually what we request.
Hey, Eric, I'm gonna interrupt just for a moment. I know we're about 5 minutes to 11. I know we've still got a number of slides to get through. I also know that we probably have some folks who are going to be needing to leave at 11. I just want to invite folks, if that's the case, please feel free to drop any questions in the chat before you go. I completely understand if you have another meeting backed up. We will keep recording and we'll get to those questions that are left in the chat box. And what I will do, like we have done in the past, is once we get the webinar sort of recorded, packaged, and ready to share on YouTube, I'll get that link out to everyone. But I just wanted to give folks just a little notification that we are getting close to the time, but we're going to continue recording. So I'm going to turn it back over to you all. And like I said, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat.
Okay, Lynn. Okay. So Lynn and I are working on a educational document we can put out called Phase 1 First. If you take anything away from this presentation and you don't already know this is what I want you to take away. You must get the Phase 1 prior to acquisition. If you don't do that, got nothing for you. You can't get funding and you don't have any liability protection. You pretty much just own what you have as is. So please get the Phase 1. You can get it from a consultant. You can pay them. Usually they'll be somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000, depending on the property. Could be more if it's a large property. You can contact me or Lynn, and if it meets the criteria, we'll do it for free. I mean, EPA is paying for it through a grant, but it won't cost you. So call us, and you must get that. Spread that word, because I'm having communities all the time saying, hey, we bought this property, what do I do? There's nothing I can help you with at this point. That's like the key to any brownfield benefit, is that Phase 1. So get that done. The rest of the slide here just kind of gets into the Phase 1. It's ASTM 152713 standard. It's being changed as we speak. We will have another standard or revised standard coming out pretty soon. But this gives you your first step of liability protection. So you got to have that. Now, the findings and the time frame. The findings is where, in a report, I might come out and say, I expect these things to be present based on past uses. If you're not a chemist, if you're not used to what environmental contamination means or is, contact us. We'll have a list of names at the end of the presentation, but Lynn or I will probably transfer you to Superfund. Those folks are the experts when it comes to what are the contamination limits and what uses are available at certain limits. So you need to understand what the potential is for contamination and the risks. The time frame, I will tell you this, and I try to get this out. If you need a phase 1 done in 5 days, contact a consultant and pay them their $2,500 or whatever, because I cannot get these done in a 5-day time frame, because while I'm trying to get out and do a phase 1, I'm also having to address all these other things. And there's just 2 of us, Lynn and I, in a statewide program. So I'm asking people to allow 30 days for me to get the whole process complete where I'm at. So that's important to know. And some people have chose to pay to get that done quicker, just because I've got too many hats to wear. Okay, next slide. Okay, so development, and I'll kind of get through this fairly quickly. The first step, obviously, you're going to have to get whatever permits and approvals you need from local or state government. So land use permits, planning and zoning, environmental permits, you're going to have to get into those and take care of all of them. I'm not going to go too deep in the weeds there. We can get you to the right people, but Lynn and I don't help you with those things. Your cleanup activities. First of all, the phase 1 tells you what is likely to be present. Depend on those chemicals. Sometimes you do not need a phase 2, and sometimes you do. The phase 2, as I said, is where they come in and sample and gives you numbers. So let's say you have a report that says we have this much BTEX or this much in terms of any heavy metal, lead, mercury. Our folks in Superfund can help you, or a consultant, depending on who you're working with, can help you understand what you can do and what you have to do to get that site to your use determination, what you want to do with it. In many cases, well, I don't want to get ahead of us. It's covered in the next slide where we talk about what you can do to actually clean it up. But you may not have to go in and dig up all the dirt that's got this contaminant in it, or you might choose to, but that is an expensive option. So there's various technologies and methods you can do to make a site safe to use for your purpose. Okay, next slide. All right, common contaminants. Asbestos. If you have a building present, it's a very good chance if it's an old building, because it's a brownfield, it probably is an old building. It probably has asbestos, probably also has lead-based paint. You need to check for both of those. We see PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls, lead and other heavy metals, and petroleum is a big one. That's out there quite a bit. One we do not have on the list, which is a new and upcoming contaminant, is PFAS. That's the perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl chemicals. So those aren't on the list because we don't have criteria for those yet, but we will soon, because it's a persistent chemical. If you're not aware, firefighting foam, FFF, that's a big contaminant or big place you'd find that contaminant from. So those are what we see a lot of, heavy metals and petroleum. All right, so here's our cleanup methods. If you want to dig up everything and remove it, put in new dirt, you can do that. You can have it tested and get it certified and go, yep, there is no problem here now. But as you can imagine, that's the most expensive choice, because you're going to be hauling potentially millions of cubic yards of dirt. Gets expensive fast. So it's usually the least chosen cleanup method. Tank removals, if you have USTs, or if you find a UST that no one knew was there, you're excavating, you dig into it, those typically need to be removed. I'm going to talk real quick about capping, because that's what we see a lot in the brownfield program. So let's say an old gas station has some petroleum contamination. In many cases, if you simply cap it with asphalt or concrete, you're good, because it'll keep it where it is. It'll stay there over time. It'll degrade when it hits a half-life, and it'll continue to degrade. And as long as you're not digging into that soil and making it mobile, you can leave the plume, cap it, and move on. Sometimes capping can be done with clay soils. Sometimes it needs to be done with asphalt or concrete. On-site treatment, which could use bioremediation or phytoremediation. Bio is using our little bacteria buddies, our microorganisms that will actually be injected into a plume. They'll eat up what's there, and eventually it'll go away. Phytoremediation will be using plants to do the same thing. You can, as a very minimalistic example, think of a rain garden. and what they do for runoffs of parking lots. Okay, that's sort of a basic phytoremediation example. Lead and asbestos. If you have a building on site, and this goes even outside of brownfield, just understand if you have a building you're going to renovate, you have to have asbestos inspection to determine if you are going to disturb friable asbestos material during the renovation. If it's there and you're going to disturb it, it has to be removed, and that's expensive. Unfortunately, asbestos is a big stumbling block for a lot of our projects, and lead-based paint. All right, remediation and controls. So there's a lot of controls. Engineering controls could be fences or asphalt. Institutional controls would be deed restrictions and easements. So these controls are typically actually put on the deed as a restriction or in the property management plan. Those are kind of self-imposed regulations. You have to follow those regulations, or then you get in trouble because, for instance, you have a plume of petroleum. You got a parking lot over it. Utility company says, hey, we want to come in and put a pipeline through here. You go, oh, okay, go ahead, knock yourself out. If they dig through that plume and make that mobile, and that plume leaves the property and migrates to another property, you are then liable because you had a property management plan or a deed restriction that said, we're not doing that. So if that circumstance comes up and the utility company comes to you and says, we want to bury something through your property, to keep yourself in good graces of DEP, you would need to contact our Superfund branch and go, hey, we got a deed restriction. This is what it says. They're wanting to put a utility through here. Can we talk with you all about that? Okay, my suggestion would be to get the utility, Superfund, and you all in the same room or virtual chat, have a conversation about that. And then if you sell the property, you have to make the new owners aware of the controls that are in place. Now, if it's a deed restriction, it'll be on the deed. They should find that in their due diligence of researching the property, but it's always good to tell them. And then ongoing maintenance, you need to keep your controls up to date. So if you've got a parking lot, you need to maintain that parking lot because it's not just a parking lot, it's a cap to keep the contaminants where they need to be. Okay, so it's not just something that we do arbitrarily. So it is a control feature. And of course, there are some tax abatements and economics incentives to help with that ongoing maintenance. All right, so we talked a little about the property management plan. It's self-imposed. Usually a consultant's going to write those. We do not write those. That is not a service that we do. So you need a consultant to write your property management plan based on the contaminants that are there. And then the environmental monitoring, our Superfund branch will from time to time send an inspector out to look at your controls. You may not even know they're out there because if it's simply a parking lot as a cap, they may drive out, look at the parking lot and go, parking lot's in good shape, come back and write that up. But they're just going to make sure that you are keeping your institutional and engineering controls in place. So here's just some tips. You won't necessarily need to use all of these, or you may depend on your project, but it helps to have a team. And you get a lot of different people, and a brownfield program is always willing to be on your team as much as we possibly can. But community leaders, might have agencies like your own, all kinds of different people. More people you pull together. I know there's one person on here and she's dropped off now. She's been involved in brownfields a lot. She would be a great person to have on anybody's team that was one, or at least if she was willing to look into redevelopment of a brownfield. Identify and prioritize your sites. So if you have a purpose in mind, you can look for brownfield sites that would meet that purpose. Sometimes people don't have a purpose other than, if it's an old community theater, let's just renovate this. So there's your purpose. But many times people that want to open up a factory, they can find a brownfield that already has the infrastructure in place. All your utilities are there, your roads are there. So I prioritize what you're looking for based on your in use. Delineate your project phasing, your time estimates. Look at your cost and potential returns. Again, this is more of a business side than maybe a community, but what is the return? The return might be happy community people and happy voters, or it might be a financial return. Look at your resource roadmap. Lynn kind of went through some of those. Some of the ways to get money. You have AML, you've got federal brownfield grants, you have, sometimes we have grants in our own agency. Currently, we're doing low interest or no interest loans. But where can you get those resources? And that's where, if we refer back to number one, a team helps, because the more people you have, the more people that have been involved in this stuff, you might get better ideas. Look for matching and leveraging resources. Creating a briefing sheet's a really good idea, because when you go to people and ask for money or ask for teams, it's nice that you can give them a pretty detailed summary of what you're looking to do with this project. Seek backing from state agencies, and you can do that from multiple agencies, actually state and federal agencies. Collaborate with your federal agency officials. Region 4 has some really awesome brownfield folks. They're more than willing to talk to you. They get back with you. They reply pretty quick to questions. Derek Street is our representative in Region 4. He's a great guy, and he loves Kentucky. So he will do anything he can do for you. And then prepare for grant writing. We can help you with that. We can review your grants. If you're going to apply for one, person I mentioned earlier who dropped off, I know has done several. I can tell you, if you ever do a grant, be patient and be persistent. Okay, those two things. The federal grants are very competitive. Oftentimes it might take 2 or 3 rounds. This year we had 2 cleanup grants, and I know both of them have applied for at least 3 years. This was the 3rd year at least. So you have to hang in there, because it is a very tight competition. Everybody across the country wants money. Okay. So these are just a few of the success stories. I'm not going to go into all of these based on time. We're about 10 after. I don't know if any of y'all live in Lexington and you've been to Doodle's breakfast and lunch. That was an old gas station. And I mention that because we, being Division of Compliance Assistance for Kentucky Department of Environmental Protection, we didn't have a hand in that one. That one took place totally without us, and that's fine. We don't feel like we have to be there. We just are there if you need us. West 6th Brewing in Lexington, the only thing we did on that project was offer a letter stating that, yes, this met the legal definition of a brownfield. They took it from there. It was great. Other times we're a little bit more involved in terms of reviewing grant applications and helping out with planning and doing different things. So Louisville Waterfront Botanical Gardens, we provided 2 loans of the Cleaner Commonwealth Fund loans to them. That's going to be a magnificent facility over there. We got projects all over the state, and some we were very involved in, and some of them we were not very involved in at all. And that's okay. We're just here to help when we can. Next. So here's some of this is our website, the top one, and 3 of EPA's websites. This is being recorded, so there's no sense in going deep into that. You don't have to write them down. You can get those. Okay. And then here's our staff contacts. So we've got 6 folks on here. They're all good people. They're all especially the bottom 3 are really very technical. The top 3 are the ones you need to concern yourself with, though, because we are the 3 that will get you to the people that can help you. Lynn and I will help with the funding and ideas. Cliff Hall will either answer your questions or get you to a person that will answer technical questions based on contaminant levels and what you can do with those contaminants. And with that, if anybody wants to stick around and you want to answer or ask any questions, we'll do our best to answer them.
Well, thank you so much. Lynn, would you mind stop sharing there on your end for us? Perfect. Thank you. I know we've had a couple of folks that have had to leave, but we did have a couple questions that I wanted to circle back to just so we can get those on recording so they can come back to them. The first one was from Paul Browning in Harlan County, and Paul is a magistrate there. And he asked, can these programs be coupled with AML funding? In particular, there in Harlan, I think, and Jeremy may be able to speak to this as well, but there have been a number of efforts to sort of seek AML funds and other sort of mine-related funds or cleanup funds. How do those programs and the Brownfields programs play together? Is it something that often happens, or is it take sort of creative planning to sort of entwine those? And I'll sort of turn it over to either of you all to respond.
Yeah, you can use both pots of that money. If you're awarded, if you apply and are awarded, it's totally fine. In fact, oftentimes whichever grant or loan award you get first becomes seed money for what comes next. Because again, I'll give you a real quick example. We had one community here in Kentucky. They were awarded an assessment grant, which means basically you're going to assess properties in your community, come up with a list of brownfield. That community drug their feet. I mean, we browbeat them to death and they still drug their feet. And it got to the point we told them, if you all do not get this done in the appropriate time frame, you will probably you won't even be considered for another grant award for, I forget the period, it's like 8 or 10 years, because EPA is like, we're going to give you the money. If you're not going to use it well, we're not going to give it back to you. And the world's worst thing you can do with EPA is give back money off a grant. They don't want that money back. They want you to use it for your community and get it done. So they look at your past history with other forms of money. So again, the first pot of money you get really is seed money. If you use it well, it looks good on your behalf and it will help you to get additional resources in the future. So yeah, you can get, in fact, we have a project right now. They've used a Cleaner Commonwealth loan. They were awarded a cleanup grant from EPA and they are currently in the process. I don't think it's been awarded yet, but they are applying for AML money. And also you have ARC funds because they are also in Appalachia. So they are looking at the Appalachian Regional Commission money as well. So yeah, to my knowledge, none of these agencies say, no, if you've gotten money from somebody else, we're not awarding it. It's kind of actually the opposite. If you've been awarded money, you used it appropriately, they're actually more excited because they know you're going to get it done. So,
and I agree. I think there is a sense of also being able to stack capital and sort of amplify those existing investments. What I will say is that while, obviously they encourage folks to seek multiple forms of these funding, sometimes there are limitations on using the federal funds as match for other federal grants. And I think that's where it gets a little tricky for communities and thinking about that seed money, but exactly can you leverage one against the other as a match or something like that? It does get a little tricky, I think.
It does, and that you can leverage some against the other and not against others. So the leveraging does get tricky. And be honest, right here, right now, I can't explain that. You have to sit down and look at the agencies and figure out the leverage.
Exactly. It's kind of a case-by-case basis, I think.
It is.
Yeah. So we have one more question here and then we'll wrap up. We received a question from Betsy Whaley with the Mountain Association. And this came when Lynn was talking about the TIF districts and sort of TIF financing. And she just asked, could you say more about TIF? Are there any sort of examples? And what I'll do is I'll include the Cabinet for Economic Development's fact sheet on TIFs that is available on their website. And I think it's maybe a year or two old, so it's fairly current. But, do you all have any sort of experience or any recollection of projects over the last few years, even though it's been sort of strange since 2019 when this stuff kind of came online, of these TIFs being used in conjunction with some brownfield redevelopment? Or can you speak to that opportunity?
I'm not familiar. I can certainly look something up and provide you with something. You can supplement it when you post this on your website. Again, it's through Economic Development Office. Eric, I don't know if you're familiar with any of these programs.
To my knowledge, there's not been any conjunction with TIF and brownfield in the last, since about 2018. Now, if it's happened, I was not aware of it. So I can't speak to any projects that have combined monies from that because I'm just not aware if they did. I don't think they have. Typically, we stay in contact with these folks and work with them throughout the project. And usually they're excited to tell us when they have additional resources come in. So I've not been told. So to my knowledge, not since about 2018.
That is probably something that we'll explore more in some of our future downtown conversations, because I think there is a significant amount of confusion about sort of what that looks like. And in particular, as the mobile home park in Rowan County has been getting a lot of attention around the use of a TIF. I think there's a lot of people paying attention to it. So I want to thank you all so very much. We've got some folks who are having to jump off. Like I said, I will have this, we have been recording, so I will pull this recording down, have it processed in just a moment, and I'll share it with my colleagues. And as that gets wrapped up, I will get that recording out. But I invite each and every one of you who have questions about the Kentucky Brownfield program to please reach out to Lynn and Eric, and let's get some of these future collaborations started and start working on those resource maps and building those teams and tackling some of these buildings. So without further ado, thank you all so much. And we will all sort of come back together probably in a month or so for our next downtown webinar. So you all have a great day, and we'll talk soon. Take care.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you,
Thank
Shane.
you all.